don't need to read it. That's all available to everybody. What we're going to do in this session is have you enter your questions on Hula. So if you go to today and you go to the agenda, get up here, and then you go to 10 o'clock, ask the researchers, DCC diagnosis and behavior. And then you hit that, and then it says Q&A. And then there's a place to enter your questions. So that allows us to probably communicate and ask questions better. You don't have to walk up to the microphone to get your questions in play. So start entering your questions and we'll start answering them. So there's one here already. I would love to know more on the correlation between ACC and OCD tendencies and the need for repetition on such things as sounds. Is there any studies on these two together? I'll let you start on all of these.
Okay. Hi, and we are, just FYI, this is my scientific dad. It's her real dad, but it's my scientific dad. And
Make me feel so old.
hey, but now we're colleagues, and that's very cool. And so we've been doing this together for a long time. And I'm a clinician, and he's a research scientist, so that's why he hands me the mic when it's these kind of questions. Okay, so no, there is no systematic research on OCD and ACC. One thing I want to just make really clear is callosal disorders are structural. They are about the brain structure, and OCD, ADHD, autism, all of these psychological diagnoses are behavioral. They're describing behaviors, and they are believed, because these behaviors tend to cluster together in people, to probably have a similar cause, and they have a similar trajectory over the lifespan, and they respond to treatment somewhat similarly. So that's why we as clinicians have grouped them and given them a name. And that name then allows people to communicate about what those kind of symptoms are and have an idea of what's coming and how to handle them. That doesn't mean that it is like having a splinter, it's not a thing that is the same in every person. Okay, so OCD is a type of behavior, a type of thinking, and it can be caused by a lot of different things. One of the analogies I like to use is if someone's limping's the behavior. Limping can be caused because you've got a blister. It could be a broken ankle. It could be a birth defect. The causes can be very different, and so the treatments can be different. Or the treatment is, for a lot of situations, is you need a brace or something. So they can be similar treatments even for different conditions. Does that make sense? So my thinking on OCD and agenesis is if your processing speed, our core symptoms that we believe are due to the absence of the corpus callosum, are the reduced interhemispheric transfer, slow processing speed, difficulty with complex new information, and difficulty with elaborative, imaginative thought, thinking about things that are outside of what's here. So if you take those as the core symptoms and cognitive challenges, somebody who can't imagine what's coming next, has a hard time even holding on to and imagining how somebody else experiences things. A lot of the people with the DCC have a hard time imagining time and quantities and variations. So that creates a sense of lack of control. And OCD is fundamentally about a need for the reinforcement and the soothing that we get cognitively and emotionally, as far as the neurological system, of doing something that then relieves this tension about something we don't feel like we have control over or we're scared about. And the research has shown that your frontal lobe is in OCD is going, for those of you who know what that means. And then you're also getting relief in the limbic system. And so it's activating emotional responses. And that's why they keep asking over and over. Part of it is uncertainty, and part of it is then that gives them some temporary relief. I know what's going on. I know it's coming. And then, but imagining it again and getting that relief again is hard. So they just keep going.
So there's another similar question here on ADHD, and there no doubt are lots of questions about autism and ACC. So let me just preface that or contextualize that again, autism, ADHD, OCD are all behavioral diagnoses. And in most cases, the neuroanatomy, neurophysiology are not well known or not known at all. In the ACC, DCC world, we have a whole different scenario. We know the neuroanatomy, and the question is, what is the behavioral outcome? And that behavioral outcome sometimes looks like attention deficit, sometimes looks like an autism kind of diagnosis, sometimes looks like OCD. So we are kind of in a different domain in which in some sense those other diagnoses are in play depending on the behavioral outcome. But what is primarily in play in our conversation is an anatomical congenital defect that has a number of outcomes. So what Dr. Paul and I have spent our careers working on is what are those behavioral outcomes? What are the things in behavior and social behavior and emotional regulation and all of those sorts of things that can be at play in talking about disorders of the corpus callosum. Let me see. Whoops. Yeah.
So jumping on the ADHD and autism. So our theory is a lot of the symptoms that you see that look like poor attention. Now, granted, you can have true ADHD as well. You can have any of those things. And I say true ADHD, meaning that it's the kind that responds really well to medication, and it has, the brain is wired to have difficulty paying attention. But in agenesis, you often see attention problems because of processing speed. Because if you are slow in thinking and following things, somebody gets through sentence one and you're listening and you're thinking about sentence one and they've said sentence two and you missed sentence two because you were thinking about sentence one. And it looks like you weren't paying attention, but you were paying attention. It was just you weren't paying attention at the speed that the information was being presented. And the other component to that is sometimes we've seen with people with DCC is taking information and making sense of it takes time. So they may hear something and you think they didn't get that at all. And then the next day they come back with it or part of it. And you think, I had no idea you understood that. Well, they might not have known they understood it until the middle of the night. And one of the things that happens in memory is a lot of our memory consolidation happens during sleep. And there's actually a whole process of our brain jettisoning, getting rid of unneeded information and holding on to what it needs. So sometimes these inconsistencies in what they know and they don't know are about these kind of processes. And the third thing is it's difficult to access information sometimes. So you may find if you give a yes, no answer or a was it this or this kind of question, they can answer it. But if you ask them an open-ended question, what happened when, they might not be able to, which suggests that the information's in there. They just couldn't get it and get it out verbally. So those are all different processes going on to retrieve the information, express the information. That's more complicated than if you're just asking them to retrieve it or recollect it. So that's why sometimes it looks like attention deficit disorder. Autism is a similar thing, we believe. Part of it is as we get to, I'm going to jump on a couple of things. Maybe it'll take care of these questions. Developmentally, our take on the development issue is that about the time when everybody else's corpus callosum goes through a little growth spurt, let's say, development spurt, it doesn't get new neurons, but right around adolescence. And so as you enter puberty, you also start to think more complexly, abstract reasoning, academically things change. You're then, of course, socially motivated because of puberty. And so then you start getting into all these fun, complicated things like she thinks that I think that he likes that, all of that complicated social stuff. And as the peers are taking off on that, people with DCC who don't have a corpus callosum are carrying on their regular trajectory. So they get further behind. You add to that processing speed. And in the hallway between classes is when all of that stuff happens, right? So you've got all this social stuff that happens as you're moving through the hallway and you're getting your books and well, somebody with DCC is missing that. They're trying to get from point A to point B. And so you start to see how one challenge can impact that whole social development and delay it. And it can definitely start to look more like autism and the social skills deficits through adolescence, and they start to emerge. So the behavioral symptoms may change as the challenges of life change.
Good. A question here that Elliot sure answered a little bit, and are there studies in ethnic groups or studies on mixed race? I noticed there are a lot of white Americans in the conference, and Elliot suggested that there actually might be slight variations, at least in the state of California data, but I think a challenge for NODCC is becoming more broader in terms of socioeconomic groups and racial groups and ethnic groups and whatever. I think we're pretty uniform in a lot of respects and probably shouldn't be, because as Elliot pointed out, the distribution of disorders of the corpus callosum is pretty much the same in all of the groups that we encounter, and need to be servicing a wider group of people, perhaps. So that's actually a challenge for our organization, I think. Another question about brain neuroplasticity is greatest from 0 to 5 and continues throughout life. As part of your study, are you using functional MRI or other methods actually to try to correlate early interventions and impact? Let me first talk about the term neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is not some unique and special thing. Neuroplasticity is what's happening all the time. So if we learn something, the plastic changes in our brain are what allows the learning to occur and to be permanent. So neuroplasticity is not a special term. It's a universal term. It's what allows for human change, human development, human memory. So and then the question is, and Linda and Elliot were raising this issue, is the importance of longitudinal research. That is, given there is neuroplasticity, given that people develop and change and whatever, what is the nature of change processes in persons with a callosal disorder? And Lynn and I have been talking at this conference about, and others have brought this up, about the need for longitudinal, but also for longitudinal into the aging process. Is the aging process different in persons with and without a corpus callosum? Again, we get back to the money issue. That is, these are going to be expensive research projects. So we have a lot of data we've collected over the last 25 years that is frozen in time in a sense. And that will take a lot of work and a lot of resources to start pushing that through, to do longitudinal work, to go back to the same people. Many of them are your family members or whatever, to say, okay, we tested you 10, 15 years ago. Can we do the same testing now in order to see how this has changed over time? So I'll let you talk about that.
Exactly. I mean, great questions. And since a lot of what we have done was doing cognitive testing, bringing people into the lab, which is really expensive because you're flying people around. And so we've moved toward doing as much as we can online. And one of the things I want to explain about the infant study and the child study. You've heard about those that are going on through Caltech. If you are not a part of those, please join them. accinfantstudy.com. It is for both infants and child. We need to do rebranding, but again, money, if I'm the one who has to do all the rebranding and it's not a good use of my time. So, but we have studies going on that are tracking 6, 12, 18, 24 months, and then annually up to age 18. And it involves questionnaires online to parents, some interviews, clinical interviews that we do remotely, so that we can start to track that kind of behavioral development and look at how things change over time. That is no longer funded, just FYI. So please be patient at our part-time staff, try to keep it going until we get funding to run the program again. But we don't want families to feel like we've given up on them. So we're trying to keep it going, keep the continuity. And those are the kind of things we keep coming back to, the financial challenges. We want to answer these questions. But the infant study is doing that. One of the things that we've done in designing it was leverage other research programs. So there's this huge research program on autism, of course, that's gone on for 20 years and has 5 or 6 sites around the United States and Canada. And they have all this data on infants, siblings of kids with ASD, and a bunch of controls. So we built our research protocol to match theirs, which means that we can directly then compare to their participants, and we don't have to collect control data. And we're going to continue that kind of model as much as we can to save money, to make it more efficient, and leverage what we can, and then do those kind of direct comparisons. We were talking about longitudinal research, really. So yeah, I think until we can track changes over time, and we had tons of those questions, this is our best option for doing it. So we'll keep coming back to you. Oh, the functional MRIs. Thank you for reminding me. Okay, so a couple things on functional MRI. We have done some functional MRI studies. And speaking of data that's frozen in time, it's frozen in my computer and needs to get published. And we've done that in adults to look at functional organization. And there are things that are pretty remarkable, like the coordination between the 2 hemispheres, even when you have complete absence of the corpus callosum. At rest, the 2 hemispheres of the brain are coordinating. Wow. Like how? We don't know. But we need to do more of that in different types of activities to understand the organization. Part of what we're proposing in the next round of the infant study that we're trying to get funded is to bring kids back at multiple times. So we get to view them in person longitudinally. And Dr. Hazley, how many of you heard Lauren Hazley present on neuropsychology? If you didn't, it's a great one to listen to when they get up on HUVA. She had just put in a proposal to the University of Minnesota for local funding so that she can test 7 babies doing MRI. And that would be really super exciting because the collaborators in Minnesota, Jed Elison, is part of that autism network. He's been doing imaging in autistic infants. They've got all the paradigms ready. So we could start doing functional imaging and structural imaging longitudinally in ACC kids. Just a matter of money.
We got an interesting question here on empathy and sympathy in ACC. And this has actually been something we've paid a lot of attention to. And
I think that's
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And we had a lot of empathy with one another. Yeah. So first of all, let me preface it by there are two symptoms, or at least you could divide the world this way, systems that we use to relate to each other empathetically. One is our bodily attunement with one another. So if I'm with somebody that's crying, I bodily respond to that. If somebody is happy and smiling, we tend to bodily respond and smile back. So that sort of empathy and everything we've seen in persons with ACC is not impacted, largely because it's happening below the level of the cerebral cortex, and the corpus callosum has to do with the connectivity of the cerebral cortex. There's another kind of empathy that has to do with recognizing what this is all about. This has gotten emotional. What is this all about, and what do I do about it? So let me give you an example. You've all heard the term emotional intelligence. So there's a scale on emotional intelligence that we gave to a whole bunch of folks with ACC, and the fundamental, it has a lot of scales in it, and the scales that reflect emotional responsiveness are entirely within the normal range. The scales that have to do with strategic utilization and strategic dealing with emotional situations are clearly falling into the range of which is below normal. So it's not so much about empathy in do I respond to your emotions? It's empathy in do I realize what this is about? Do I know how to strategically manage the situation such that it has some trajectory that comes out? So I would say, you know, empathy in one sense, entirely, you know, in the normal range. Empathy in the other sense is going to be often problematic. You've got a lot more to say. You're the clinician.
No, I agree. I think the one thing caveat I would add is we've also done things looking at the ability to recognize facial emotions. And so that's impaired or at least an area of challenge. So if you can't recognize the emotion, you can't empathize. And a lot of the people with DCC talk about they may feel something, but they can't label it. So they can't put the word on it. So you might see that they're distressed, and it may be that they're picking up on the distress in some situation that they've been in and empathizing emotionally, but they don't know why or what or how, because they can't make sense of those feelings. So putting their feelings into words, alexithymia is the term that we use in the publications. That is a challenge.
There's a question here that we can't answer, but the fact that we can't answer it is important, and is a question about sleep in ACC. So with the adults group, we asked them about sleep, and I was shocked, actually. Everybody says they have issues with their sleep. And so when Lynn and I are at conferences like this, we're always thinking about domains of issues in ACC that we just haven't studied yet, and I'm not sure. There's some sort of anecdotal survey kind of information will be interesting, but it really will take engaging people in the sleep research with sleep labs in order to answer that question. So, yeah.
So last summer, when the International Research Consortium got together, our last meeting, one of our collaborators in Italy brought her MD PhD student who was lovely and is very interested in sleep. So Ludovica has been kind of hammering at me over here, and we've added sleep questionnaires to the infant and child study. And those are the same ones that she's doing in her cohort in Italy. So we'll be able to compare and have larger groups. But she's also doing a study that is actually doing sleep studies in septo-optic dysplasia and is intending to bring in children with ACC to be able to do that kind of work. And there's some like 2 or 3 studies out there about sleep in children with ACC. So that is definitely a new and interesting area. And we have a researcher who really wants to do it. And she does have some funding for that. So we're just supporting her in any way we can.
Okay, there's a lot of questions here, so I'm just sort of randomly going through the stuff that kind of triggers something to me. A question: Down syndrome adults are prone to get early onset dementia. Is there any indication that ACC adults are more prone to dementia? And again, that's the kind of question that is going to have to take the longitudinal kind of research that we just haven't done yet. So I'm sure you.
My only other comment on that is, as I've talked about, many of you have heard me say, somebody with DCC is working on a backup system. Their brain is already using adjusted systems to do everyday function. So as any kind of pressure comes on, like age-related changes in cognition, you might see those be more apparent in somebody with DCC, maybe at an earlier age, more extreme. That wouldn't necessarily be dementia. It's just they already have cognitive challenges, and you add normal aging, and it's just more obvious. That would be my expectation. Hey, I've been meaning to talk to you.
There was a couple of questions about sort of environment and learning and change over time. One, do we have a hypothesis for the dramatic differences in outcome between isolated ACC individuals? And I don't think we have specific hypotheses or necessarily research data. We certainly get a lot of anecdotal feeling for this being around this conference and the other people that come into our research. So I really think that we can't get overly deterministic about a brain abnormality in terms of the eventual outcome of any particular person. There's a lot of the environmental situations involving, you know, what kind of home environment are they in, what kind of school environment in, what are their friends like, that influence the outcome in agenesis of the corpus callosum. So it's a field that probably, well, I can't even imagine doing a really in-depth study of a lot of individual variation, because it's difficult to track and difficult to think how to set up the research. And so you're the clinician, you can talk.
Well, and this is my vision. This is my hope and dream, is that we can work together, the scientists and the families, to build out a system where we can get enough information about enough people with DCC and get good behavioral data and genotyping and neuroanatomy, that we can start to use computational methods to parse this out, to figure out what predicts one direction versus another. And the only way to do that is to have all of this information put together and to have as much information about each individual as possible. So when you start hearing us talk about this big, dream of data merging and data centers, that's what it's for, to be able to do this. I would say that the genetic underpinnings of the complete ACC can have an impact. The other thing is practice and experience. And my 2 things that I come back to, plasticity, but you have a limited amount of cognitive resources. Some people call it their spoons, some people call it whatever, but you have a limited amount of cognitive resources. You want to offload as much of that load of cognitive demand as possible. We do that by routines, lists, put your keys in the same place when you come home, use the same backpack, use the same system from a 5-year-old who carries a calendar to school looks a little silly, but if you started at 5, they get into the routine. And by the time they need it at 10, 11, 12, they're used to carrying it. It's not a big deal. So you start implementing support systems early. And I think that's going to help because that is offloading processing challenges. And the other thing is practice and automaticity. Take on one task, work it, learn it, get it automated. And if you're learning reading, that point when they shift to let's read to learn history, if the kid hasn't learned reading, they're not learning history, they're just learning reading. It's a reading task. So always think about, is one domain getting in the way of the other? And have we really mastered this? And if not, how do we master it? I mean, the adults brought up Sam Richard and his Rubik's Cube. Talk about a great example. It's bimanual coordination, it's speeded, it's all the things we would say would be a challenge for somebody with DCC. Sam is tenacious as nothing else. And he has learned it and he's beat it to death. And he does it well. But it's because he does that well. Doesn't mean that he could do every other bimanual coordination well.
There's a number of questions here about medications, and Dr. Paul and I will just not answer those. Those need to be answered by your physician, and probably Elliot Sure is the most important and the right guy to ask questions about medications. So we'll just avoid those. There's a question. Well, first of all, answer quickly a question about prevalence of ACC, DCC, as far as.
The only study that's been done over a population is the one that Dr. Scheer was referring to. For 20 years. They looked at the population of California and looked at registry of birth defects by the first year of life. And in that study, it was 1 in 4,000. We believe that it's probably higher than that. And part of what's changed is since they did that study, we now have a diagnostic code. And so one of our previous board members was a part of a big, one of the main insurance providers in the United States. And so he pulled the data the first couple of years that diagnostic code was instituted. And it looked like more in 1 in 2,000. That's in the US and that's our guess.
Yeah. So it's certainly more prevalent than we expected it would be when we first started doing this research 25 years ago. We thought this was really rare, and it turns out not to be as rare as we had assumed then.
It is the most common neurodevelopmental diagnosis. And it's still considered rare, but it is the most common.
And this relates to the next question, and that is what we had talked about earlier about the confusion of diagnoses. Individuals with ACC or DCC getting a number of different other kinds of diagnoses. And the question is, does that mixture of diagnoses actually confuse things to make it harder to get funding specifically for ACC? And I would suspect absolutely, particularly the confusion between ACC and autism. You want to talk more about that?
Well, yeah. I think as far as getting services, I will say you guys need to have those behavioral diagnoses to get services. And if you ever get somebody who says, oh, they have corpus callosum dysgenesis, so they don't have an autism diagnosis, just call me. Because I've got paragraphs written in my computer ready to send, because this is not true. So your behavioral diagnosis needs to be done for you to get services. As far as funding goes, you're right. One of the first things we often hear is, oh, well, DCC is heterogeneous heterogeneous population. It's really a bunch of different genetic conditions. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a shared cognitive impact, and it doesn't mean that researching the whole group wouldn't be hugely informative. I think one of the challenges that we continue to struggle with has been some of our branding, because we started out with agenesis, and now we've been doing dysgenesis. And I will tell you, sitting there in Minnesota, in that hotel room, we had a whole debate about the term, the naming of this organization, and we chose disorders because we didn't want to use dysgenesis. We wanted to leave it open to kids that had damage to the corpus callosum at some point, or some other things that might impact them. So disorders is like the super duper umbrella. Dysgenesis is what we're talking about on all these developmental conditions. And dysgenesis covers hyperplasia, agenesis, partial agenesis, et cetera. So really moving toward dysgenesis is where we need to be. Now, the thing that's probably confusing to some of you is you saw they had slides that said CCD, corpus callosum dysgenesis, instead of dysgenesis of the corpus callosum. Part of that is because in other languages, it goes the other direction. Part of it is because of the deleted and colorectal cancer gene that got confusing. You've seen us write AGCC because if we're talking about the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, in a paper about ACC, it gets very confusing. So you have to differentiate. So one of the things that I think we do need to do is decide, and since it's OSDOC and NODCC, I think DCC makes sense at this point, but we may still publish in CCD in literature. So just know that those are going to go back and forth. But as far as branding, we got to decide and go with it. Disorders.
Yeah.
So Deanna was saying that it's disorders, or disorders of the corpus callosum is the way we're right. So let's stick with what it says here, disorders of the corpus callosum as our branding. One thing I will tell you is in the booklets, like Corpal has a great information booklet you can get a PDF of. I would encourage you to use that. It's awesome. We try to be very clear about the source of our information. So sometimes I'll talk about dysgenesis, and sometimes I'll talk about agenesis. All of the work that we did on adults was in agenesis. And I don't know how well it applies to hyperplasia. In the child data, we've actually ended up doing dysgenesis work, ironically, even though we called it the ACC study. But so we'll refer to it as that. So sometimes scientists will be very specific, and that's just because of the source of the information.
Yeah, I just say one other thing is clear to us that autism is eating up a lot of the funding, or maybe not eating it up, but they're getting a lot of the funding. So
Fragile X, man.
I
There's
know.
only one gene involved.
Yeah. So there's a lot of advocacy work to be done with people who are doling out the money, and to make them aware of disorders of the corpus callosum, to make them aware of the relationship of that to autism kinds of disorders, and the importance of looking also at callosal disorders.
Yes. Yeah, having a diagnostic code is definitely going to help. And that diagnostic code is malformations of the corpus callosum. So here, let's throw that one in. But yeah, I think having a code or a clear condition is very important.
Okay, let me see where we're over here.
There's the autism that you brought up. Do they have any similarities in at all, besides one being a physical non-autistic
So
or autism in general? Can we partner with the autisms to get some funding because we're partners, because they're very, very similar?
Yeah.
we've leveraged the autism thing to some extent. There is an overlap even genetically with autism. Dr. Shear had a whole grant that was focused on one of the genes that's common in both conditions. So wherever we can, we leverage it. But I think that's a strategic thing that I'm afraid would ultimately get in the way of DCC getting recognized. And so standing on your own and saying, yes, they have autism symptoms. Yes, they have these behavioral symptoms, but really saying, and what is great about our condition is we can tell what it is. It is concrete. You yes or no it. It's not a big fluffy, we're not sure what this kind of behavioral thing is. It's part of what makes this stand out.
So I'll brag on Dr. Paul here. She got way back, got clinically certified to diagnose autism, and then did the diagnosis schema on a whole lot of folk with global disorders, and 25% of them, in terms of a standard diagnosis for autism, would be recognizable as autistic. So the point you make about the overlap between these disorders is significant, is important to have recognized, and also for us to recognize it in terms of where we go looking for money and support and the kind of research that we've been talking about that we have yet to do, that the longitudinal stuff and a lot of the genetic stuff that they want to do is going to take greater funding, and that's where we hope to find some of it.
So, well, I have a microphone. There are a couple of things that we talk about a lot with the adults with DCC, and I've talked about in some of the sessions, but I don't usually get a chance to talk to this whole audience. And one of the things I want to hit home to everybody is if your brain is wired this differently, I mean, these are major wiring changes, you may be able to function remarkably well. Development may progress normally. Obviously, we've got adults with DCC who are really smart. That doesn't mean, and we've got adults who weren't diagnosed until they were 60, right? And didn't know. That doesn't mean that it didn't impact their lives. And it's important for them that you don't go so far as to say, oh, come on, you can just do anything, without acknowledging, and you're going to have to do it differently. And you're going to have to make choices about your energy, and you have to manage your energy, and you have to focus on different things. And that's part of their frustration that I will bring back to you, is they don't want to be viewed as disabled as impaired necessarily, but they want that challenge to be acknowledged and included in the plan. And so overcoming is so important. And you've got to be aware that every day your child is doing most of the things they're doing differently. Their brain is doing it differently, and that's going to have consequences. So their optimal behavior is going to be different than the next 10 minutes. It may change very rapidly. One of my favorite anecdotes was a 21-year-old, super smart family, all very high achieving, and she was very bright. Her verbal IQ was 99th percentile, top. And she'd just gotten the diagnosis. So I did the testing with her, and I sat her down and I drew out a map of her cognitive functioning. And I said, you're 99th percentile verbally, your processing speed is first, bottom. And she said, oh, well, that explains why I'm smart sometimes and stupid sometimes. And to give her the freedom to say, yes, you are every bit as smart as your siblings who are doctors and lawyers. And your processing speed is a serious limitation on your ability to use that capacity daily in multiple such situations, etc. And so it was giving her both honor for who she is and respect and acknowledgement for the challenges she faces. And I think that's a really important thing to hold on to together. This is an explanation for why things are different and why you might experience things differently.
Maybe one more question here about oppositionality and explosive anger in ACC. And is it due to ODD or due to structural brain issues? That kind of comes under the neuropsychological term of executive functioning. That is, how well do you monitor your behavior and inhibit and control things like emotional outbursts. The frontal lobes, where most of this occurs, are connected through the corpus callosum, the front part of the callosum. So you would expect that there probably is impact on their fundamental executive functioning. What we found generally is it's not as dramatic an impact as something like processing speed or complex understandings of situations, but it is an issue and probably related to the connectivity of the frontal lobes.
So I would say the executive function component of it is what Warren's referring to, that the ability to do problem solving is not necessarily impaired because of the corpus callosum. But if you have a limited amount of resources emotionally and cognitively, and somebody pushes you just a little bit beyond where that threshold is, and you don't have a lot to pull from to cope, and you don't have a lot of practice with that coping process, you get explosions. And so that's why you can go from okay to not okay, and why rules and rigid things become an issue is in part because this is my strategy to deal with the world. If I use these rules, I know how to behave socially. I know how to do what's coming. And you just took that away from me. And I don't know what's coming next, and I'm not sure. Big emotions. Jasmine's area of interest is emotion regulation. And so that's something we've been studying in infants. We're going to follow it through into adulthood. But I think really focusing in those early years, those years of plasticity on, yes, you're going to focus on all the basic learning skills that a child has, but getting ready for kindergarten, emotion regulation is the thing, man. Their ability to have systems in place to handle frustration, to handle other people, to respect it, all of that. Arousal regulation is a skill that will serve them forever. And so I would view that as something to be very focused on as its own important skill set.
Yeah. And the question really is a part of the question in the research domain is whether this is secondary to your slow processing and your inability to calculate well what is going on socially and what has happened before and what has happened after, or are the basic inhibitory regulatory systems impacted more directly? And that's the answer to that question we just don't totally know. And maybe Jasmine will figure it out for us. And
but this is also an important one that I wish we had more money for fMRI studies, because a lot of you will tell us that they can go from really upset to leave the situation, come back, and they're fine. And the rest of the family is sitting there going, oh my God, what just happened? And they're like, so what's for dinner? And so sometimes the emotional recovery is remarkable. And it seems really confusing because other times they get fixated on something that happens and they won't ever let it go. And I think, so those are two different mechanisms that are going on. And I think the emotional feedback, the other part of the not learning from emotional feedback is a really important thing to know. That you yelling louder or getting more upset is probably not going to make that much of a difference. No, okay. So it's there, you as a parent getting angry and increasing the intensity emotionally is going to have far less impact than a clear behavioral limit. If you set the limit, institute the limit. And if it feels like it's super big to stop a behavior, but it's one that you want to stop for good and forever, dig in, do it, hold it. It's got to be immediate and contingent, not thinking about what you did in the past. Remember, imagination's not good. And so, oh, remember when this happened? Or let's talk about what might come and what might happen. You're not going to get much traction with that. But you just did this. You knew you weren't supposed to do this. We're gone. That can have an impact. They'll remember those kind of immediate things, especially when it's something they really wanted. And it's done. And it's clearly because of their choice. That's going to be a behavioral thing that we think is because of the difference in how they process emotion.
Thank you for all the good questions. We haven't gotten to all of them. We're running out of time. So Dr. Paul and I will be around, and within the limitations of our cognitive processing, we will do our best to answer your questions. Thanks a lot.